Well, thank you very much. Part of the creative process, how I write these talks and all creative work that I do online, I have this big yellow notepad behind my bed, and I add all the ideas that I want to talk about and link together into this notepad. And for this talk, I was doing just that, but for whatever reason, there was a huge issue. And there was one idea on my mind that totally consumed my process. And so after 1 month of having this notepad out, there's only one single word, and I have the page right here. The whole thing is blank except for one single word that I felt I had to bring to you today, one idea I wanted to explore. And probably Mr. Benjamin in the back is going to be smirking at this. The one word is colony. Colony. I couldn't get this word out of my mind when I thought of coming to England and talking to you all here today. It's strange. The word sounds harsh. It falls like a gavel, proclaiming the final sentence on everything and everyone in a time or place. I'm not so sure why colony or colonist should even be a pejorative, yet somehow the word still stings. Now, finding myself a rather accidental dissident influencer over the past few years, an enormous amount of my time in dialectics is receiving pejoratives. And so I feel like I'm something of an expert of them. But still, colony is odd. For whatever reason, I don't remember the first time I was called a neckbeard or a reactionary or a chud. But I do remember the first time that I ever heard my country called a colony. And it was almost 30 years ago to the day, right here in Oxford. Actually, to be more exact, it was, I think, about 20 miles north of here in a suburb called Kidlington. At the time, my parents, both minor university professors in California, were on sabbatical working at Oxford, and they took the rest of the family to tow to England so that I could be here for a year and study in the schools. In hindsight, I can say that this was one of the greatest privileges I've ever received as an American millennial, not only being able to see pre-Blair Britain, but to live in it for a brief time as a child. The year was nothing short of magical. I probably remember it first and foremost for the coincidental exposure it gave me to British authors of the young adult variety, as I discovered greats like The Secret Garden, Narnia, and The Hobbit, not simply as texts, but also within the land upon which the authors walked. I know this sounds horribly provincial and American to say, but it was genuinely a religious experience as a child to be just a bus ride away from the previous residence of Tolkien or Lewis Carroll, and even a somewhat longer bus ride away from London, the gateway to the greater story of the British Isles, the home of the kings and queens of yore, not to mention an urban culture unlike anything that I was used to seeing in a place like San Francisco. London was strange. It had a deeply native working class at the time, obsessed with a game that we Americans called soccer, where the fast food of choice was fish wrapped in newspaper and, oddly enough, roasted chestnuts. I think it was this early experience also that gave me my lifelong fascination with history. There's something about the earth of England that felt infused with it. The small pebble path between my home and the local Tesco, the meadow behind the bungalow, and the tiny chestnut grove behind the primary school all became the perspective backdrop for a ghostly historical drama that set my childhood imagination ablaze. Every plant seemed to grow from the bones of a Viking slain on the field of battle. Every road led to an enchanted castle, and I was convinced that you might see the ghosts of Caesar Legion marching across the football field behind my home, looking to claim Britannia for the Senate and people of Rome. Even the adults in England were different from the ones that we had in America. They were earthier, folkier, and more from the land. They wore their age more prominently on their faces. And what was so remarkable was their total lack of irony that seemed to inhabit everything in the culture of California. In my parents, and even a little bit in my maternal grandfather, himself an old school San Franciscan who came of age in a pre-World War II Bay Area. Here in England, this type of affectation was almost absent. people strive for something more than just sounding smart and cool, and they held their pose in forms that contained a matter-of-factness and even a little bit of judgment. And I remember feeling a little bit of that judgment the first day I attended school in England, where my old schoolmaster, who I swore looked identical to Tom Baker's Doctor Who, called me up to the front of the class to introduce me. "Please say hello to David," he said rather gruffly. "He's from the colonies." The colonies. What was that supposed to mean? Of course, I knew it wasn't an insult, and I wasn't so much offended as taken off balance. In fact, I think I spent the rest of the year processing it. I didn't think of myself as a colonist. America generally, and California specifically, was supposed to be the center of the world. Of course, part of this was the moment of realization we all have as young children that the things we grow up around aren't universal defaults, but actually specific things. But I did notice in this moment that there was something about the old world that was distinctly lacking from my home. And this revelation only grew in my mind as I returned to my native state, California. I noticed that the place was radically different. The earth was drier, less situated, more present in a way, and also more hollow. And although we were supposed to produce everything in California, when I really dug down and tried to see what was behind it all, it felt like ultimately there was nothing there. And so I finally went to my father with that great question that occurs to many American children of a certain age. And I said, "Dad, are we a colony?" Really, I don't remember getting an answer to this question or what an answer would even look like. I suppose I didn't know exactly what being a colony would even mean. I knew about the 13 colonies in the Revolutionary War that largely took place somewhere on the East Coast sometime in the past, with localities and symbolism that seemed to me as distant as the stories of Robin Hood or even Star Wars. Really, the only exposure I got to this colonial world outside the unit in school was a set of Ticonderoga pencils with a Minuteman printed on them, and of course the 4th of July, a holiday that I never really liked, but I do suppose it's somewhat better than the British national holiday, which largely involves burning Catholic monarchists in effigy, so I guess America has that. But being a colony, that seems to imply something darker and more squalid. It wasn't just about being ruled by a power. Everyone is ruled by a power. It wasn't just about the issue of democratic representation or the principle of taxation without representation, the prime motive for the American Revolution, now rendered absolutely meaningless in the era of state-controlled speech, inflationary money printing, and ballot harvesting. Being a colony implied that you were something lesser, not a people in your own right, but a function of a machine. A colony was a place where the land and the people were fed into that machine for entirely alien purposes, to be harvested, used, reprogrammed, and reconfigured as the masters deemed fit. To be a colony was an insult to any free people's dignity, who always, even when ruled, guarded their pride, purpose, and ownership over their own lives and their children jealously. It was this sense of injured pride, and I would maintain not some silly Enlightenment idea from Thomas Paine or John Locke, that first led the American founding fathers to seek their separation from their fellow British subjects. And it was this injured pride that always struck me as the one living legitimate grievance of the mewling third world activists we hear about constantly. Everyone wants to know where they're from. Every people wants to be themselves and proud of themselves and give birth to children and even distant posterity that share in that pride. And being a colony robs a piece of that wholeness from them. And California, as rich and independent as it was, in fact, seemed lacking this very wholeness. California was supposed to be a great place to live. And indeed, I did very much enjoy growing up there as a child in the 1990s. But then, where were the castles? Where was the history? More importantly, where were the stories that we were supposed to tell each other and hand down to our children, as seemed to be everywhere in the old world? Maybe I thought, someday, in 100 years, my native state would have the same spirit I remembered seeing so vividly in the United Kingdom. Perhaps it was just a question of architecture. For the longest time, as a young child, I thought that if I ever got fabulously rich, I would buy one of the lesser unused castles in Europe and have it transported back to California. It's a great idea. Little did I know that William Randolph Hearst actually had beaten me to this ambition by almost a century, very famously constructing his own American castle out of pieces of European ones on the coast of California in San Simeon. Much later, I remember visiting this monument. I think I was a teenager then, feeling another piece of the puzzle fall into place. In San Simeon, a genuine American aristocrat had built a genuine American castle. But something was off. All of the architecture, each of the murals and pieces of art from the Italian Renaissance, and the classic sculptures were torn out of their original context. The meaning and depth that they had once contained in their native lands had been obliterated by the process of transporting them to the Pacific coast. Instead, the spirit of California had entered into them, and in the windswept, empty castle had become part of the cold and beautiful coastal landscape, an artifact of a brief period of optimism in the 1920s, but really only a testament to the broader futility of trying to import a soul and history into a place that couldn't sustain it. Now, for those unfamiliar with the history of the American West, I really need to point out here that the issue was not a lack of history. California, this part of California in particular, was full of history. Hearst Castle was the real historic setting for the most famous scene in the most critically acclaimed movie of all time. That's Citizen Kane, by the way. Standing on top of Hearst Castle, you can look east and see Salinas Valley, the setting of almost all of John Steinbeck's famous novels, south to the missions of Junipero Serra, and north to San Francisco, the riding home of Jack London and later Mark Twain. But none of this history mattered or seemed to leave any impression on the place itself. It was like there was a hole inside this state, like the urn of the daughters of Daniel. No matter how many events or important people came into California, no lasting sense of location could ever be produced. No lasting sense of peoplehood would ever emerge. California itself was a kind of nowhere land, an anti-cultural epicenter. It did not so much hold history as it seemed to wash it all away. At the time, for me, this was only personal. But I think a lot of Americans, many Americans of my generation, feel this absence of a distinct ethnos as distinctly in their collective concept of themselves. Maybe this was something that we could fix. The message always, the story of America, its propaganda, was that we could build a new nation here that reflected the best of the new world and the old. But this was illusionary. And I didn't really realize the extent of the problem until much later in life. I returned to Europe during a gap year of college. Traveling across Western Europe during the early Obama years was incredibly surreal. In the group, I think, one of two ethnic Europeans out of a total group of 40 people, taken largely from the Bay Area, and I was certainly the only person who knew anything about the continent's history. The trip was designed to teach Western culture and Western ideas, to tell the story of Europe broadly. For propagandistic purposes, this built up to the culmination of the EU, but leave that aside. That was the apex civilization. But true to the millennial cohort raised in the Bay Area, inside a culture that we would now call wokeness, nothing could be perceived as less interesting or less cultural. And what was really strange was that everywhere, the hosts who lived in these locations we visited ratified this low opinion of their own history and culture. One interaction in Berlin, now seared into my mind, occurred when one of my classmates told their German host how happy she was to have finally found a cross-dressing burlesque show on offer in the city, repeating in a manner that only an American tourist could, that unlike the rest of the country, she was relieved to know that Berlin at least had real culture, just like they had in San Francisco. And far from recognizing this rather blithe insult, our much too gracious host embraced the observation, quickly piling on that provincial German culture was embarrassingly close-minded and quaint. Okay, back up. We had just finished retracing the steps of Beethoven Goethe. We had seen Germany from the countless beautiful but rather empty villages all the way up to the finery of Sanssouci. But somehow we didn't encounter real culture until we wandered into the deracinated nowhere land of Berlin. Who decided that Berlin was only authentic if it mimicked the authentically fake and gay culture of San Francisco? Wait, back up again. Who decided that the only authentic culture of San Francisco was fake and gay? Certainly not my grandfather or any of the older inhabitants of the city who built its beautiful architecture, who fought and won the original war against Germany, who made the modern world. What was actually happening didn't sink in until I finally returned to England. Of course, everyone knew that Germans were self-hating continentals, but England was the land of the bulldog, the Churchillian spirit that was ever proud. I remember much from my time there previously, but everything seemed to be reversed. Instead, in place of the old London I remembered from my childhood, there was a new city of glass and steel, a city of commerce, media, and new things that were happening. But also a city totally detached from everything that it once had been, removed from history and altogether much less English in its architecture, in its ethnic competition, in its ethnic composition, and also in the attitudes of its people. Gone was the stoic frankness that I remembered. In was the familiar irony, the consumerism, and the obsession with everything that was cutting edge. It was startling when I finally understood. England was being colonized by the spirit of California. And this felt like a betrayal. Something was backwards. I mean, the transatlantic relationship is well established. Americans are supposed to mock Europeans for being old imperialists, and you're supposed to mock us for being fat culturalist slobs. It's an ecosystem. But now we were all being devoured by the empire of fat culturalist slobs. It was as if the strange, memoryless property that inhabited California had been isolated, weaponized, and exported to the rest of the earth to melt it down into a gray, candy-colored cultural sludge, a standardized simulacrum, a comforting blankness, ready to be managed, controlled, sterilized, colonized. And here is when I began to understand the thesis that multiculturalism was not multicultural, but anti-cultural, and California was the forum of the world's destruction, though we had not yet met Lizzo. I've struggled with this question ever since. We know that decline is happening. It is an open quandary here in all the talks we've experienced today, how much this process can be it can be arrested or even reversed. I think that the question falls deeply in England, the beating heart of the old order and one of the greatest cultures of the Old West. Because we all know that if being an Englishman does not mean anything, then no ethnicity anywhere means anything. And in the light of this greatness, I think it's only natural to want to preserve what once was and to make oneself a force of conservation. But I believe that we should approach this proposition with a great deal of reservation. I think this is a sense that everyone has right now because I've heard it multiple times across this conference and really since 2020. There's a fundamental futility in the Roger Scruton style of conservatism, which, while in its stronger forms is very aware of the circumstances of modernity, makes a fundamental mistake in temperament as it clings to the idea that there is a continuous national superstructure that can be salvaged with only gradual adjustments. But while you certainly do have a deep legacy to defend here in Europe, unfortunately everyone is in the same postmodern boat. There might be a real California hiding under the dross, the layers of bureaucracy and the human excrement, just as there was a pre-World War II Germany that my paternal grandmother idolized but never visited, and a real England that I experienced briefly before the Blairite Revolution. But trying to go back, even under the guise of preservation, would be futile. It would be like trying to step into the same river twice or put together a shattered glass. What we're staring down now is not a gradual decline, but a sudden shattering, a maelstrom of entropy. As they say in tempests at sea, the only way out is through. I hear this often as a platitude online, many times during this conference, and it makes a nice poetic way to end the conversation. But we need to start treating this observation as the beginning. And I would maintain that answering this question is the primary reason we are at this conference today. We recognize what's looming on the horizon, and we want to believe that something wholesome, something good, and something beautiful can be brought out the other side. Yet the problem we are looking at is so far outside our own experience and our own understanding that it is very hard to imagine anything that would resemble a solution. And this problem will be compounded for the generations that come after us, because just as the memory of the old world evaporates, so too goes its prosperity. Just as Western man has organized everything about their identities around the idol of hedonism and material prosperity, that idol falls to dust in his hands. And in its place, what will be pushed on us again and again and again is the same spiritual poison we see coming out of the mouths of our leaders. Self-pity, backbiting, reduced expectations, and learned helplessness. Learned helplessness. I think about that a lot these days. I think that's the enemy more than managerialism or decline or the cathedral. It's a fit word for so much of the problems that I see in the eyes of the younger generation and what I fear for in my own son. We know the system is wrong and evil, but everything else has been devastated and emptied so that we cling to the problem itself as our only lifeline, just as it devours our lives. And isn't what that truly means to be colonized at a deep spiritual level? To be possessed by the spiritual force that destroys you? Where would a solution even start? I know academic agent talked about the spark coming in the form of someone like Genghis Khan or Charlemagne. But I do think that it starts earlier in the civilizational cycle. They say we're in winter. I would say that we are in late fall, early winter. There's a step that needs to occur here, a primordial spirituality that needs to be discovered. For many years, people have noticed a seeming contradiction in my work, a perspective that always relied on two themes. The first is a focus on realism, essential to understanding politics descriptively, and the second is an embrace of anti-materialism and spirituality as the motivating substance of all politics proscriptively. I like to see these two ideas as the dual dispensation of the two greatest philosophers of all time, Dante Alighieri and Niccolò Machiavelli. It's easy to contrast these figures and treat them as rivals, as obviously James Burnham famously did in his first chapter of the Machiavellians. But despite their differences, I believe these two Florentinians actually dovetail together in a simple observation that any political founding or restoration begins first with belief. Essence precedes form. Spirit rules the body in both speech and both peace and conflict. And therefore, all true wars are wars of religion, and all true warlords, all true Genghis Khans must be born from a primordial spirituality that precedes them. The preceding of the spark is not just carry-on, but a substrate that can actually perceive religiosity, perceive spirit. Therefore, the only antidote to spiritual malaise, the threat of learned helplessness, is to rediscover that new foundational spirit. Now, there's a very non-original idea that I've been harping on a lot in my recent essays, the idea of basic beliefs or core spiritual values that are, in fact, axiomatic to human communities. These beliefs and conceptions are so fundamental and so necessary to our operation as thinking members of a society that they remain, as Joseph de Maistre reminds us, impervious to logic or questioning. These basic beliefs might include, but are certainly not limited to, such things as the ultimate importance of family, the difference between men and women, the value of your own peoples and their uniqueness, and yes, a holy meaning to man's existence, what our ancestors would have almost universally called God. The fact that these beliefs intersect with questions of history and scientific fact is almost irrelevant. These ideas must remain intact for us to resist the forces of chaos that abound in the world. The basic beliefs provide an answer to the ultimate question, why a human or a human community should be allowed to exist in the first place, which, for the fans of Spengler in the audience, we will all know that this is the question that, if ever asked seriously, spells doom for the person or civilization who asks it. This forms one of the first central paradoxes of basic beliefs, and that is that they are themselves answers to a question that cannot be properly answered or analyzed. Properly asked or analyzed, I should say. And as such, simply stating them does not accomplish their task. Basic beliefs have to be internalized, cherished at a pre-rational level, or they are no good at all. Another interesting but rather secondary paradox about these types of basic beliefs is how they occur. As many people have pointed out, among humans at least, many of the basic beliefs across civilizations are very similar. As C.S. Lewis observes in his essential work, The Abolition of Man, one could group these beliefs under a universal umbrella term. C.S. Lewis calls it the Tao, although you could use natural law and basically say the same thing. But the infuriating addendum to this, the infuriating thing about basic beliefs, in all their manifestations across different cultures, is while they resemble each other, they are universally not universal, just as human beings themselves are universally not interchangeable. Every civilization's Tao, while possessing a common essence, only exists in a particular form. It can only be learned by a particular people, situated in a particular time, and living in a particular place. Which makes our problem all the more frustrating today. If it is true that we have become detached from the civilization that formed us, and how do we, lost children of modernity, recover or reforge these types of fundamental beliefs? How do you cultivate spirit or foster value within yourself of things that cannot be properly argued or analyzed? When you have no people and are detached from your time and place, is there even a good place to start? It sounds bleak, but history and academic agent have an answer. Suffering, pain, war, privation, and collapse. These things obviously will reverse the process of entropy through the force of pressure. Hardship is the tectonic force that forms the basis of all meaning and peoplehood. Weak men create hard times create strong men. You know the drill. And history of civilization is cyclical for a reason. But I do think that there is another way. Because humans do, in fact, organically cultivate basic beliefs within themselves. They do this through the process of habit, ceremony, and the celebration of things that are truly holy, which is everywhere expressed in things that are simple, heroic, and ordinary. Just as man's character is ultimately defined by his actions, and thus the best way to form a man is through habit, a people are defined through their collective habits, and they are formed through their traditions. This is how I appreciate tradition, not as nostalgia, which I despise as the worship of dead things, but as a language of love that carries throughout the generations. It connects us in some part to the past, but ultimately, we do not owe anything to the dead things of this world. Rather, tradition is ultimately important because it is part of an authentic life. Humans are not individuals, but part of a greater living tapestry of existence that spans many lives and generations. We take what our parents give us out of deference, and we give to our children the best of ourselves, knowing all the while that what we pass down to the next generation is not simply time-tested, or Lindy as we say online, but an important part of their identities. and thus how they will, in turn, create meaning for themselves. In times of civilizational contraction, this process is put to the test. When we encounter a period of chaos, we are forced to come to terms with what really is important, what deserves to be preserved, or alternatively, what deserves to be forgotten. The things that we carry past this point in time will matter. Some things may be heroic, challenging, and grand, others comforting and pedestrian. But all things that survive through this period will be basic and possess a kind of spiritual simplicity. When thinking about this, I'm drawn back to one particular scholar, Jesus of Nazareth, and I promise you this is not going to be a sermon. But there's wisdom, I think, that can be appreciated even if you're an atheist or of some other religious persuasion. Here I look to Matthew chapter 19, when a young man approaches Jesus for spiritual advice and is unceremoniously asked to give away all his possessions and follow God. When the young man refuses the offer, Jesus gives one of his more stern pronouncements and says that it is easier for the camel to enter into the eye of the needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Often this is taken by leftists as a socialist tirade against any modicum of bourgeoisie wealth. And indeed, I don't want to rob the passage of any of its radical implications that I think always should remain, even if we ourselves do not want to or cannot embrace poverty. But I think there is power in the more prosaic interpretation of this passage. That Jesus is alluding to the camel not entering so much into an impossibility than the camel entering into a narrow gateway, the eye of the needle as an architectural fixture, a passage forcing the beast to be unburdened of their wares and fitting in only through their needs. That should be a picture, but I don't think you can see it. Only that which is humbled and stripped of its superficiality can discover what is truly essential, because wealth, entertainment, and the products of technique are distracting and blind us to the everyday holiness and divinity that stands behind every moment. When this superficiality is stripped down, we clearly understand what is strong. And this is what's so essential about civilizational winter. The darkness of winter allows for true spirituality to be observed. And so the eye of the needle may be seen less as a prohibition than an act of purification, not in the sense that any of us will ever be completely free of superficiality or sin, but simply that to pass through from here to the other side of this trial, we must be ready to let the meaningless things go, regardless of how comforting we find them. And thinking about what remains after we pass through this eye is terrifying. Cowardice, not greed, stopped the rich man from following Jesus. When a person or civilization is born with luxury, luxury becomes part of them and defines their identity in an utterly perverse way, to the point that we all convince ourselves that we can't live without it, that we are nothing but our wealth. Therefore, as our wealth begins to die, as our civilizational strength saps through the managerial impulse, we begin to fade into the background as well. In a sense, the radical contrast can be made here between nostalgia and tradition. Nostalgia binds us to the comfort of the superficial, the product of wealth, the technique without the soul. Tradition, proper tradition, is an act of self-giving, an undergoing, a quest to liberate the self from the moment of a single generation and to be connected to the whole, the spirit, the collective, motivated only by love and appreciation for the simple things and basic values. Now, this is horribly abstract in a sense. We still don't have any clear idea what a revival of a tradition would look like. And here, there's nothing really remarkable I can offer you. Some of these patterns of life will be the old things you already know as Englishmen and Englishwomen. They are the things that hang in the background of this place, the small pieces of manner and courtesy, the tea and crumpets, the long walks in the country, the aspects of village life carried on even if one lives in a pod or a 15-minute city. the things that don't make sense, and the things that Guardian readers think are quaint and backwards. To put it a different way, Great Britain will never fit through the eye of the needle, but Little England may yet. And outside these plain things that we take away from our own culture's tradition, if we have one, new things will also be formed, always in community, always in real life, and with some form of dedication and sacrifice. Thus we may find a revived spirituality from our fellowship, our cooperation, and our dedication to the countries that once were and may be again in the future. Now, I've been accused of being quite rambling in my talks, and I agree that sometimes my use of mixed metaphors gets the best of me. So perhaps I can summarize the main points of my talk here. First, the cultural crisis and dislocation we are experiencing in our individual countries is part of a larger process by which the technocratic machinery of the Western Empire devours the civilizational substrate that birthed it. A self-destructive process almost impossible to arrest at the macrocosmic scale because it has slowly deconstructed and removed the tools that we need to confront it, literally moving us into a mode of learned helplessness. Second, the solution to this crisis is to attempt to break free spiritually and psychologically from the mechanisms that are driving it forward in our own lives. And this break must be first and foremost a spiritual break from the wealth-focused values of modernity and a re-embracing of the intuitive, the human, the religious, and the poetic, the foundation of the basic beliefs that characterize an old civilization or a new one. And lastly, the only way to discover these poetic moments is to return and treat more seriously the small elements of life carried out in a real community, with consistency, constancy, and in the mode of religion. And this development will be particular because these foundational beliefs and values must be deeply located in common experience, common blood, and common geography. I suppose it's that last point that makes it very difficult for me to find a proper ending to this talk, since the statement begs a final difficult question as I stand here speaking to you today as a visitor. The question is, what is the heart of the eternal English spirit? What is your own peculiarity that will survive the upheaval, the next upheaval, and will carry forward, God willing, from this point to the end of the world? This is a question that I approach very difficultly, with great difficulty, as a foreigner, as Californian by nativity, American by nationality, and a German by ethnicity. I am a person from nowhere, in so many words, but I do think that I can offer some insight here. I can perhaps see the magic of this island as an outsider, just the way I saw a certain magic in the very boring suburb of Kidlington, UK. And I can say what I see from the colonies. For want of a more common experience, I will retreat here to literature. Now, perhaps it's the inner Teuton in me, but I've always felt that the Grail legends were the key to understanding the spirit of Englishness in its eternal form. Though I know that some person in the audience is going to voice an actually, and inform me that these legends are largely French in origin and therefore not properly Anglo-Saxon. Still, for my own money, the story of Parsifal is particularly compelling because it seems in its many forms to prefigure the beginning of a new Christian world, much more than something like Beowulf, which I always saw as more of a lament for the older pagan one. Now here I know that every summary of the myth is going to be problematic because between Crétin du Troyes, Wolfram von Escherbach, and Richard Wagner, there is no way that I can summarize it without someone in the audience, probably with a PhD, grilling me about one of the details. The stories can't even stay consistent about whether the protagonist is Galahad or Percival. So they all have similar plot elements that emphasize common themes. So I'll brave a summary here. The story begins with an innocent boy, Percival, living alone, fatherless, in a cottage hidden away from the world by a mother who does not want him to be killed in a life of adventure. One day, upon seeing knights riding by his home, Percival decides that he needs to seek his fortune in war and rides off to King Arthur's court, but not before being given a special vestment by his mother that she says will keep him safe. Percival's adventures then begin to take a strange turn. He's much too young and awkward, and as he enters the court in Camelot, he's greeted with laughter by the youngest maidens there due to his ridiculous appearance. But oddly enough, this fulfills some strange prophecy, and Arthur sends him on a great quest. Almost immediately, Percival encounters the legendary bloodthirsty Red Knight, who he challenges and miraculously defeats seemingly out of luck. This act of unwitting heroism then sets in motion another set of strange events, where Percival discovers a mysterious enchanted castle ruled over by an even more mysterious Fisher King, who's dying of a wound that's been given to him by a magical bloodied spear he keeps at his side. At dinner, Percival learns that the Fisher King is dying, and so too is his kingdom, and that it can only be solved by solving a riddle. It can only be cured by solving a riddle. Just after, a beautiful virgin enters and displays a grail to Percival, which he does not understand. As Percival leaves the next day, the castle vanishes behind him, and our hero learns that he failed his quest, which was not so much to defeat an enemy, but to solve the riddle of the grail by asking it one question. The rest of the tale is that of Percival fighting to discover the knowledge to this question and to return to the Grail castle. He suffers many hardships and is most famously tempted by one enchanted maiden who continuously tries to rob him of his chastity. Finally, as a much older man, and after discarding his mother's vestment, Percival rediscovers the enchanted castle, and the same scene plays out with the Fisher King, the bloody spear, and the maiden with the grail. Percival realizes that what he is seeing is a revelation of God's will and asks the grail the one correct question which heals the king and the kingdom. The question is, who do you serve? I love this story in all its divergent forms because of how intellectually infuriating it is. Half pagan syncretism, half Christian heresy. And I'm glad to know that Nietzsche also struggled with Wagner's version of the story when it appeared in a highly modified form of his last opera. If you were an artist in the 19th century, the best symbol is as Nietzsche being infuriated or troubled by the work you've produced. That's a sign of greatness. The story stands the hero's journey on its head. Does it commend masculine virtue or subvert it? Does it promote bravery and heroism or meekness? The hero is a knight in his pursuit of masculine virtue, breaks from his comfortable home life, but then all his victories and conquests seem accidental. His intentional victories all come from self-negation, possessing a kind of monastic attitude. And that's not to mention the strange relationship the tale has with women, devouring mother, enchanted temptress, or holy damsel. Each seems to be the face of the same woman in the Joseph Campbell sense, and in some tellings, they literally are the same woman. You could write many books about the meaning of this tale, but there are several distinct themes here that I'd like to draw out to capture the greater meaning of England itself. First, in this tale, I feel we see a prototype of spiritual Englishness in the form of the knight. There's a certain type of stoicism unique to Northwest Europe. This feeling is embodied in the quest, the road, the eternal call to wanderlust, which the Anglo-Saxon found first in the trails and wilderness of his own country, and then later in the oceans of the world. The struggle and the journey are essential, but they are just the first step to the greater purpose of cultivating inner strength against the backdrop of adversity. Second, we see the very English rejection of nostalgia. Percival must cast off the shackles of his own comfortable life, shedding the last vestment of his mother's clothing that she gave him to enter the true knowledge of himself and his mission. Inside, I think we see a prefiguration of the Faustian spirit. The hero loves the truth and reality too much to be fascinated by a memory of something that has long since ceased to exist. Life cannot be sacrificed to the dead, and so the old home must be left behind for greater things, just as the English left behind the bones of the Roman Empire, to find a new civilizational mode. So too now, just as we must leave behind the bones of the old Western world order. A similar tension, I think, is found in the image of the fairer sex, presented each time as a riddle. Just like the desire for the past and the comforts of home life, the nature of woman occurs paradoxically. The knight must reject his desire for the female to be truly worthy of her and embrace her holiness in the right and proper way. Then finally, we have the ultimate lesson, the question of purpose, found in the symbol of the Grail itself, the holy hearth, and the dying king. Here, the lessons of the previous two virtues are brought together and contrasted. Percival's tale ends with his discovery of the Grail castle and the Grail maiden, a new home and a new sacred feminism, redeemed for the purpose of greater truth. For the English, it would seem, God is encountered on the road and in far-off places, but it only ever resides inside his own sacred castle, his own sacred family, the home that contains the things he loves and holds to be most sacred. Also in the image of the king and the final riddle of the Grail, we see what the Englishman's inner strength really serves. Virtue does not exist for the man himself, but to be given back to the world for the greater purpose of truth, goodness, and beauty, which the Grail represents. Therefore, in turn, the ceremony of the Grail, within this, the knight takes on this broader vision of goodness. He makes it part of himself, part of his inner character, so that in every foreign land to which he travels, people will recognize him as a forerunner, as an emissary for the kingdom of God and a greater good to come. I suppose this ultimately does answer my original question about how one might practically recover the groundedness of place lost to modernity. We must carry place inside of ourselves, in our actions, in our faith, in how we dress, in the poetry and the songs that we commit to heart, the meals that we serve to families and guests, in the prayers we speak, pagan, Christian, or secular, and in the charity and chivalry we show to others. A new England will live inside each Englishman and Englishwoman, because all new futures, all new civilizations start internally. Just as the Grail invites the Spirit of God to physically dwell inside its receiver, calling each to be a new builder of a holy kingdom for his people. This is the power of all nations, but England most prominently in my own imagination, because the English are a far greater people than the empire they created. They are more than their colonies and their conquests, and they're therefore more than the machine that now seeks to colonize them in turn. And people all around the world, whether they were part of the empire or not, admire this when they see their banner. The true gifts of the Anglo-Saxon gave to the world were not technology or science, the trade routes of the empire. It was not the railroad or the sewage systems, or even the universities and the literary tradition of the English tongue. The true gift of the Saxon was the spirit of the knight, the reverence of home and hearth, the stiff upper lip, the refusal to accept fate and back down, the cultivation of that which is strong within, and the refusal to hoard that inner strength only inside themselves when it was intended to be shared with the world for a greater spiritual purpose. For all empires and civilizations will fall eventually, but the sun will never set on the spirit and nobility of Percival, the wounds of the Fisher King, and the spirit standing behind the Grail. And in this age, I think we have a chance to rediscover it. Thank you very much.